the Paris Commune of 1871. In Paris, there was a communist uprising. France was at war with Prussia, and the French government surrendered. And the workers of Paris, and the communists and the labor unions, didn't want to be conquered by the Prussians. So they took up arms on their own, and they formed their own government to fight off the Prussian invaders. And it was called the Paris Commune of 1871. And the French government that had just surrendered teamed up then with the Prussians to crush the Paris Commune of 1871. And the Paris Commune of 1871 was considered to be the first workers' state, or the first workers' uprising, the first dictatorship of the proletariat by Marx. Marx had first urged the workers of Paris not to revolt, but then they did it anyway, and he supported it. He said it was the right thing to do. And he said that the workers of Paris, they were storming heaven, right? And when it was defeated, the military that came into Paris executed people in big numbers. There was a huge amount of executions before firing squad. And they were lining up people to be executed. And some of the guys, some were women. I mean, their women were a big part of it too. There was a woman named Louise Michel who was famous. She smoked a cigar like a man, and she would light the cannons with her cigar. And women and men together, they were all being lined up, and one by one they were being shot, and then they were throwing their bodies into these like open graves, these shallow graves. And so somebody, we don't know who, had the idea that as they were being shot, they would do this with their fists. And so they would shoot them, and then, you know, they'd have their fist like this, and they'd throw them in the graves, and after they shot a number of people, they'd put dirt over them. But there's something called rigorous mortem, which is that when you die, your body, your muscles loosen up, and your body expands. And so these people who did this when they were dead, and the executioners would look on in horror as fists came up out of the ground. And it became a symbol of revolutionary immortality. It was the idea that even if we're dead, we live on in the struggle. So that's the origin of the fist. So that's where that comes from. So if you see somebody doing that, that's what it means. The Haymarket Affair in 1886. Now what happened was that there was a protest demanding the 8-hour workday, and there were people all over the country, hundreds of thousands of workers in 1886, refused to work on May 1st, had a one-day strike demanding an 8-hour workday. And the demonstration took place on May 1st in Chicago, and it was a mostly peaceful demonstration. The next day, there was another demonstration that happened, and the following day on May 3rd, there was another demonstration, even bigger, miners, other workers, and the police opened fire into the crowd, and 2 protesters were killed. And there was a lot of anger among the people in response to that. There were some leaflets that were put up by radical anarchists and others saying they wanted revenge, etc. It's not clear who made those leaflets or whatever. And then the next day, there was another demonstration on May 4th, and at that demonstration, a bomb was thrown at the police, and a police officer was killed by a bomb. And then the police started shooting. There was a lot of death. I believe 7 people died on that day. And they arrested 8 anarchist labor leaders for setting that bomb, allegedly. Now, only one individual could have been proven, and that was this guy Louis Ling, was ever proven to have ever even made a bomb before. Louis Ling apparently, there was some evidence he had done something and possibly made a bomb before. But these other guys, they were convicted for their words. It was because they hadn't told people not to bomb the police. It was that with their agitation, they had stirred up people, essentially. And they were convicted in a trial, and they were sentenced to death. Now, Louis Ling, the only guy who'd ever made a bomb, the only one that could ever prove it ever had anything to do with any bomb, he actually blew himself up in his prison cell. He smuggled a stick of dynamite into the prison cell and put it in his mouth like a cigar and blew himself up because he didn't want to be killed by the state. The others were hung, and it was a cause that caused a huge amount of outrage because they were essentially executed for their words. There was no evidence that they had ever set this bomb. There was no evidence that they had somehow been involved in a plot. It was just that with their advocacy, with their political rhetoric, they had inspired this bomb to possibly take place. Now, there were some others who were given clemency and were not sentenced to death and eventually got a pardon. But the May 1st International Workers' Day, which is celebrated around the world as Labor Day, comes from this struggle in Chicago for the one-day strike in 1886 that led to the subsequent events that led to the execution of August Spies, Adolf Fischer, Albert R. Parsons, and George Engel, and Louis Ling, who prevented his execution by committing suicide ahead of time. And these individuals are referred to as the Haymarket Martyrs. And at the time, many people considered their execution to be outrageous. Albert Parsons, he was a veteran of the Civil War. He'd actually fought on the Confederate side. But after the Civil War, he'd had a change of heart, and he actually married a woman of color named Lucy Parsons, who's also buried here. But Albert Parsons and others, their conviction angered many abolitionists because, basically they argued that if, just a few years prior to this, in the 1860s, when slavery was still going on, you could have executed an abolitionist for what they had said. They were killed for their words, essentially. There was no evidence that they had actually planted this bomb or done it. Now, people don't know who actually made the bomb. It could have been a provocateur. It could have been an angry worker who was angry about the workers who'd been shot down beforehand. We don't really know. But their execution was considered a great miscarriage of justice, and it was all over the world. People became sympathizers, and that's why we have International Workers' Day up to this day, because of the 1886. What's interesting is they're all Germans, because back then Germans were considered to be a very radical ethnic group. Many of them had come to the United States because of the 1848 German Revolution, and there were a lot of German immigrants that were leading these rebellions. August Willich was a Marxist who became a general in the Union Army. Joseph Wedemeyer was another Marxist, a close associate of Karl Marx, who ended up leading the Union Army during the Civil War. And the first kind of Marxists and radicals in America were Germans who had fled in 1848. So much so that at this time, German Americans were associated with radicalism. And then later it became Irish Americans, Fenians, who were associated with radicalism. Then it became Eastern Europeans and Italians, and it kind of shows there's kind of I guess you could call it continuity of a new wave of immigrants are considered to be radicals and dangerous. Now there's a lot of feeling that Latinos are dangerous, right? And we need to be afraid of them. And that often the argument was that Marxism and socialism, these were foreign, un-American ideas, right? And that they were imported from foreign countries, we should be afraid of them. And they played up the fact that they were not born in America at their trial. They played up the fact these were foreign guys, and that they played up that these posters had been put up calling for revenge, which these guys, there was no evidence they had even made these posters, but regardless, they ended up getting the death penalty for that. Because of the Haymarket incident here in Chicago, this is why Chicago is considered kind of a key place for the labor movement.
August Spies, presente! Presente! Adolf Fischer, presente! Albert Parsons, presente! Louis Ling, presente! George Engel, presente! All right.
Michael Schwab,
presente!
Oscar Need,
Presente!
Samuel Fielden,
Presente! All right. Now, just to be clear, those guys did not get the death penalty. Their sentences were commuted and they were eventually pardoned. Yeah. But yeah, there's some more important
I have
grades.
more about Haymarket
Oh, go ahead,
Square.
please. Go ahead.
Like what
Yeah.
David and I were talking about, how history is erased, and they try to hide it from us, the real people's history, and you're talking about them having it towards different days at the beginning of May. At least you guys got closer than we did here in Chicago, because we had it moved to, there's lots of labor holidays, but it wasn't an accident that they moved ours to the end of August or beginning of September, right? And call it Labor Day, which most people don't even relate to. Like in other countries, they call it Workers' Day, which everybody knows what a worker is. I talk to my students about this, and I use it is there a holiday that everybody in the world, everywhere, almost every country celebrates that is, no matter what continent, what culture, what religion, maybe New Year's? Is there anything else? And I'd ask my students, because they're from all over the world. And, oh yeah, Labor Day, yeah, May 1st, May 1st, May 1st. I'm like, really? So most of the countries in the world celebrate May 1st as International Workers' Day. And here in the U.S., no, our Labor Day is not So why? What happened? Where, and then when they find out it's Chicago, it's just a few miles away from here where it happened in the story, that's why I say lots of stuff about slavery, reconstruct, so many things in our history. It's like the fact that they hid it from us is almost more interesting than the actual story, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the follow-up question. Why? How come we are the only ones that don't know about this, right? And the monument at the actual site at Des Plaines Avenue downtown, not related to this one, and Randolph, of course, the original square was, quickly disappeared and just had streets and buildings, everything built over it. And the only monument that monument is like 20 years old. So it was like, the immigrants' rights movement, the anarchists, the movements in the 90s. I remember when they finally got, over 100 years later, right, a monument where the actual site was. But the only monument that existed, besides this one, right, since in all the 20th century, was a policeman, a monument to the policeman killed, or policemen, I guess it was several. Not the civilians killed the protesters, and everybody knew it was a sham, right? The trial from that time, and always the same old false flag, just like it's always done. So this monument, when I first, because I was born in Chicago, but grew up in the suburbs, and when I came to live, like I think it was '89, and finally said, I'm going to look for a job, stay here. I had a tour by an old African-American activist that knew everybody and everything in Chicago, and he gave me the greatest leftist tour of people's history of Chicago, and one of the sites was he said this monument, to the policeman. It was on some overpass, some bridge, downtown, an expressway, and he said, this statue, people in Chicago that know the real history, they so angry. This statue mysteriously lost its head a couple different times. I can't remember, end of 60s, early 70s. But it was probably, I don't know. But that was the only thing. I don't know. I think that's gone now. And they put the actual monument. But very interesting history about. And also, I wanted to mention Lucy Parsons.
Yeah, well, her grave is over there. Yeah.
You're going to talk about her. Yeah, she was. I think it's something like the quote is the Chicago police said she was a woman more dangerous than 1,000 rioters, and she said a lot of outrageous stuff. Very interesting personality who lived almost to 1940 or around 1940, I think, right? Yeah. So that's what I wanted to say. It's very important to revive our history.
The individual that I know the most about here is William Z. Foster. William Z. Foster was from an Irish family in Philadelphia, and he joined the Industrial Workers of the World. He was a founding member of the Communist Party, lived just an amazing life. The death date here is actually not correct. He died in 1961 in the Soviet Union. This is the date that they buried him. It was after his widow, Esther Foster, she had died as well. And William Z. Foster actually died in the Soviet Union because he was an elderly man. The National Board of the Communist Party were put on trial for conspiracy to teach the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. William Z. Foster was so old at the time, and he had a heart condition, he didn't end up going on trial. He was declared not fit to stand trial. And it was, just a few years before his death that they finally gave him a passport and allowed him to go to the Soviet Union. And he spent his last couple of years in the Soviet Union in a hospital bed, and he ultimately died. But his last act was on his 80th birthday in 1961. He was born in 1881. And for his 80th birthday, Khrushchev came to visit him in his hospital bed. And at the time, the Soviet Union and China had just had their falling out. And from his hospital bed, elderly 80-year-old William Z. Foster, there with the Soviet leader, read a speech honoring Mao Zedong and honoring the Chinese Revolution as an act of defiance against Khrushchev. And that was his last act, and he died several months later. And that was William Z. Foster. This was his widow, Esther Foster. What's interesting is that William Z. Foster, he never had any children through Esther, but Esther had 3 children at the time they got married. So Esther had 3 children from a previous marriage. And I guess they met at a commune in upstate New York, and they fell in love, and they got married. William Z. Foster actually dedicated his last book to his grandson, Joseph Manley Colco, and the book is called The Twilight of World Capitalism, and the book is dedicated to my grandson, Joseph Manley Colco, who will live in a communist United States of America. That's the dedication of his book. Now, this guy is Eugene Dennis. And Eugene Dennis, he was the person who acted as kind of the primary spokesperson for the Communist Party during the McCarthy hearings. At the time when they were calling Communist Party leaders before the House Un-American Activities Committee, they basically said you could either take the Fifth Amendment and then you couldn't answer any questions, or if you answered some questions, you had to answer all the questions, or you would go to jail for contempt. And so Eugene Dennis, he was the one who was kind of given the permission to go and read a statement before the U.S. Congress representing the Communist Party. Everyone else took the Fifth Amendment. So he came in prepared to make a statement before the House Un-American Activities Committee, but they knew that his birth name was not actually Eugene Dennis. He was born under another name. He changed his name to Eugene Dennis. And so rather than let him read his statement, they demanded of him, "What is your name?" And there's a clip you can watch of him before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they're asking him, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Eugene Dennis." And they say, "Well, what name were you born with?" He says, "My name is Eugene Dennis. I pay taxes under that name, and never under this name or any other name have I ever dishonored the United States of America." And then the congressman, who's asking him, he says, "What's your name?" And the guy says his name, and he says, "You're a poll taxer. You're a supporter of Jim Crow segregation. That's who you are." And he was held in contempt of Congress for doing so. Quite a defiant stance that he took. That's Eugene Dennis. Now, Jack Johnstone, he was a close associate of William Z. Foster. So William Z. Foster, before he joined the Communist Party, he was a wobbly, but the IWW had a policy that they would not join any union that wasn't communist, that wasn't revolutionary. And William Z. Foster said that was cutting them off from the majority of workers. So Jack Johnstone and William Z. Foster, they broke away from the Wobblies and they formed the Syndicalist League of North America. And they came here to Chicago and they worked for the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, and they kind of infiltrated the local AFL and they organized the meatpacking workers into unions, which was a huge accomplishment. And the way they did it was World War I was happening at the time, and meat was essential. You needed meat to get to those soldiers out on the front so they could fight. And so what they did is they held public hearings here in Chicago where children who worked in the factories would testify about the bad conditions. People who'd lost their hands or an arm or a leg in the machines would get up and testify. And the press was there, and it was just showing the bad conditions and then hinting that they might go on strike, even though it was illegal during the war to have a strike. They never actually threatened to strike because that would have been illegal. But they had these public hearings testifying about the really awful conditions in these meatpacking facilities and how people lost body parts and children worked for pennies an hour. These were immigrants from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, and from Italy largely. There were some black people from the South who had migrated up, but it was largely Eastern Europeans, Irish and Italian workers. And through this kind of public relations campaign and the hint of a strike, President Woodrow Wilson brought in an arbitrator and they forced the meatpacking houses of Chicago to sign a union contract and recognize the Stockyards Labor Federation. And based on that, William Z. Foster and Jack Johnstone went to the AFL and they said, "We want to do this in the steel industry." And so they launched the steel strike of 1919, which was one of the biggest strikes in American history. It was right as World War I had ended. Workers all across the country, something like 365,000 workers in the steel industry walked off the job, demanding that they get a union contract in the steel industry. And it was like a pitched battle. And in many states, there were many deaths on the picket line. Many people were killed. And they called William Z. Foster and Jack Johnstone to the White House. And President Woodrow Wilson assumed that because they were in a union, they must be very ignorant. So President Woodrow Wilson spoke to them in what Foster called roughneck talk when he met with them. And he said, "This strike you're having is hurting our economy. You need to sign a contract," and it was a big incident. The other thing is that William Z. Foster, he'd been a wobbly and a radical. So he was called before Congress during the strike, and they had one of his pamphlets that he had written as an anarchist or whatever. And they said, "Now, do you still believe this?" And he said, "Oh, no, that was my youth." And 2 years later, he was a founding member of the Communist Party, so he was completely lying through his teeth. He was completely lying through his teeth, but he pretended to be a moderate in order to not have the strike broken up by the government. But the strike was not successful. They lost. And after the strike was lost, William Z. Foster was considered discredited by the American labor movement. He was a failure. They had this huge strike and it had been defeated. So he went back to work as a railroad worker. He was a car knocker. He had a big hammer, and when a train would derail or whatever, his job was to, knock the car back so it could, and he was a car knocker. But Lenin sent an invitation to William Z. Foster from Moscow and invited him to go to the Soviet Union, where they were trying to form a new international labor federation. And when William Z. Foster got to Moscow, he met with Lenin, and he found out that Lenin had been urging the American communists to support the steel strike the whole time, and that William Z. Foster's idea of what he called boring from within, joining the reformist labor unions and pushing them to be more radical, that was an idea that Lenin had had as well. And the concept of the militant minority, boring from within, was something the Bolsheviks had done in Russia. And so on that basis, William Z. Foster left anarchism and became a communist leader. And it was here in Chicago that his organizing took place, and it was very key. There's a couple other people I'd like to talk about. This is Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the Rebel Girl. It says, the Rebel Girl, fighter for the working class emancipation.
Good song.
And yeah, the Rebel Girl is a song that Joe Hill wrote in honor of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was an Irish American in New York City. She had bright red hair, and she was known for soapbox agitating. She would stand on a soapbox, and back then there were no microphones. And she would stand on a soapbox and she would speak like this, because your voice projects more over a crowd if you do that. And there were certain techniques that the soapbox agitators would use. For example, they'd have an imaginary argument with somebody. They'd pretend the person who disagreed with them was standing next to them. They'd have an imaginary argument, and they would point, and gestures were really important because most people were seeing you from far away. So you'd stand there and you'd make big gestures, and you'd point, and you'd speak. You'd try to project your voice up so it would carry more. That was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and she was known as the rebel girl of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world. And she went around agitating for the rights of workers on the job and to build the IWW. One of the most famous things she did was in Spokane, Washington, because all over the country they would have what they called free speech fights. Because in little towns, the Wobblies, the IWW would come and start preaching their message, and the town would have a city ordinance forbidding the preaching of radical ideas in the town. So if a radical came to the town and was arrested, the call would go out for people from all over the country to come to that town and get arrested. And so thousands of people would come to the town, and the jails would be full of people, and eventually the town would back down. And the longest free speech fight was in Spokane, Washington, where thousands and thousands of people from all over the country went to Spokane, Washington to get arrested. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, she came all the way from New York to get arrested, and she made a point of when she got arrested, before she gave her speech they would arrest her for, she chained herself to a telephone pole. So the police would have to cut the chains to get her out, and they took her to the jail. And when she was in the jail, she found out that the jail was being used as a brothel by the police. The police were using the jail as a brothel. So she exposed that, and that in the national media, and it made a huge incident. And ultimately, the city of Spokane, Washington, gave in and said, you have the right to preach socialism in Spokane, Washington, and gave in. That was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. What's interesting is that William Z. Foster was her good friend, but she didn't join the Communist Party for many years. She didn't ultimately join the Communist Party until the 1930s because fascism was considered to be so much of a threat. She had concerns. She was kind of anti-authoritarian. She was a radical free spirit, so she didn't quite like the idea of Stalin and the Soviet Union. But when it became clear that the communists were at the center of the fight against fascism, then she ultimately saw that the communists were on the right side. She joined the Communist Party in the late 1930s. During World War II, she was a big member of the Communist Party, and then she was sent to federal prison as a member of the National Board of the Communist Party USA. And she was sent to federal prison in West Virginia, and she was in federal prison for many years, and she came out of prison, and she was a leader of the Communist Party until her death. And I believe she died in the late 1964 is when she died. After she got out of prison, she toured Eastern Europe, and I've heard recordings of her. She toured Eastern Europe, and she said, many workers in Detroit and in Alabama and Kentucky and Minnesota and Chicago will be happy to know there is no unemployment in the Soviet Union or in any socialist country. And in fact, she said in her speech, when they bring in automation into the factory, the workers don't fear that they're going to lose their job from automation. They applaud because they're happy because the automation is going to make their jobs easier because there'll be less work to do. And that's the difference between the capitalist system and the socialist system. Is in capitalism, automation leads to poverty, and in socialism, automation and innovation leads to better abundance for all. And that was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a great anti-fascist, a great working class hero, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, the rebel girl. So, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, presente! All right. Who else is here? Who else do we have?
You must have been listening to the streams, Kenneth.
Yeah. All right. Now this is William L. Patterson, eternal fighter for civil rights and socialism. Now why does it say civil rights there? The term civil rights was invented by the Communist Party. After World War II, the Communist Party had fought for black liberation, and they decided to rebrand the black liberation struggle. And so they formed an organization. Instead of calling for black liberation or Negro liberation, as they would have said, they said we're going to fight for civil rights, and they formed the Civil Rights Congress. And the Civil Rights Congress was headed by William L. Patterson, and he was the leader of the Civil Rights Congress. And it was an organization that if a black man was charged with a crime in a southern court, they would provide his bail, and they would send lawyers from New York City to represent him. And civil rights was the buzzword that they used to support the black freedom struggle. And eventually that became the phrase that Martin Luther King Jr. and others used, civil rights. And William L. Patterson had the opportunity in 1951 to bring a petition to the United Nations to talk about racism in America. And the petition was called We Charge Genocide, because the UN had been formed and the Soviet Union was what they call a Security Council permanent member at the United Nations. So they had the right to bring a speaker before the UN. So they brought an African-American communist named William L. Patterson before the UN, and he gave a speech called We Charge Genocide, talking about lynching, talking about the economic conditions black people face, and comparing it to what the Nazis had just been convicted of in Nuremberg. And that was basically the argument. That's why he called it We Charge Genocide, because the United Nations Charter had outlawed genocide, because genocide was something that the UN had been formed in the aftermath of World War II to oppose. He accused the American government of genocide against black people.
I would add it was with W.E.B. Du Bois, because people often have heard of that name, but I think they prohibited him from traveling or something, and with Paul Robeson too, right?
Yeah, Paul Robeson was part of the Civil Rights Congress, as was W.E.B. Du Bois, as were a number of people. Now, what's also interesting is I knew older communists who talked about how what they did is they took the petition that William L. Patterson had given at the United Nations, and they photocopied it, and they went door to door in every black neighborhood in the northern industrial centers selling it door to door and saying, you know, there's 1/5 of the planet that's on your side against the American government, and that's the Soviet Union. And they just had, gave this speech at the United Nations supporting you, and that laid the basis for what Martin Luther King was able to do. Going door to door with the petition of William L. Patterson, the leader of the Civil Rights Movement. What's interesting is also that one of the main lawyers for the Civil Rights Congress was Bella Abzug, who eventually became a member of the U.S. Congress, representing New York City, representing Manhattan, and she was a lawyer for the Civil Rights Congress. She never actually joined the Communist Party, but she was a lawyer for the Civil Rights Congress. Yeah, go ahead.
That's one of the charges against the Uhuru movement, is bringing a petition charging genocide before the United Nations.
Yes, and when was theirs? Was that in the 90s? Or when did they did it?
Well, no, they had a convention in 1984, right, charging genocide. But then they recently did a petition based on that, and they took it to the United Nations, and that's one of the things that, just like back then, right?
Like 10 years
the
ago
U.S. government is saying that it's Russian inspired, right? And it wasn't, and that's their right.
It's really important
Under the Constitution, under the United Nations Charter, that's their right to bring that petition. And the government of the United States tried to say it's illegal.
Another thing that I would like to point out about this, well, first of all, I guess I'll point to another grave and then I'll tell the story. But this is Henry Winston. Now, Henry Winston was an African-American man who was on the National Board of the Communist Party, and he was one of the ones who was convicted of conspiring to teach an ideology that might necessitate the overthrow of the American government. Now, a lot of people misunderstand it. They think, well, they were charged with advocating the overthrow of the American government. That's not actually true. In many of their pamphlets, they said we favor a peaceful transition to socialism. What they were convicted of was things that Marx said and things that Lenin said, and it was the way the law was written. It said conspiring to teach an ideology that would lead one to the conclusion that it was necessary to overthrow the American government. And never could they ever prove that they had actually advocated the overthrow of the American government, but they proved that they did teach that Marx and Lenin were good guys, and they did sell their books, and their books might be interpreted in a way that said you should overthrow the American government. That's what they were convicted for. You want to talk about a long hoop, but that's the way the Smith
You can
Act.
say the same thing about Sam Adams and Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah. I mean, and at their trial, they did. They read the Declaration of Independence. If someone was distributing that on the street, right? It would be the same thing.
Right.
So Henry Winston, he was one of the only African Americans who was sent to federal prison, along with Benjamin Davis and a couple others. But he was one of the only ones, and he lost his eyesight in prison. He was given medical neglect, and that's why it says here, "They took my sight, but my vision remains." They took my sight, but my vision remains, because they ultimately, he came out of federal prison blind as a result of medical neglect. And he's a brilliant writer. You can read many pamphlets that he wrote about the Black freedom struggle. He was one of the main advisors to Angela Davis when she was on trial, advising on the strategy for her campaign. But the reason that William L. Patterson and Henry Winston are important, and you can't underestimate this, is, I've told this story many times, so those of you here who've heard it before, I apologize, but those of you who haven't heard it, it's a really important story, and I hope you'll tell it to other people. When I was in high school, I had a teacher who was really into local history. I'm from a little town called Orrville, Ohio. And in my little town, they had a town newspaper, and there was a headline from 1951, from the same year that William L. Patterson took his petition to the United Nations. And the headline said, "Take that, Uncle Joe." And what the article was about was that the first black family in Orrville, Ohio had bought a house. And the article began with a quote from Stalin about how America is a racist country. And the article went on to say that clearly isn't true because this black family has been able to buy a house. And that shows you how connected the black liberation movement in America and the Soviet Union and the Cold War were. They were intricate. There would have been no civil rights movement if it hadn't been for the Soviet Union. If it hadn't been for the fact that the Soviet Union got up and castigated the United States for the way it treated black people. If it hadn't been for that, there wouldn't have been a civil rights movement. That was the only reason that the Kennedy family and other figures in the Democratic Party started supporting civil rights and started allowing a civil rights movement to emerge. And you can't downplay that history enough. At the time, there were many African countries that were aligning with the Soviet Union. And the USA was saying, don't align with the Soviet Union. They're a brutal dictatorship. We believe in democracy. So they would show, the Soviet Union took the picture of Emmett Till and his mutilated body, and they sent it all over the world and said, oh, this is democracy, this is freedom, this is what you do to black people. That's the freedom America believes in. And there were even instances of diplomats from African countries facing racial discrimination when they came to the United Nations and other places. And there was a feeling among the American ruling class that racism was hurting the USA in the struggle against the Soviet Union. It was hurting the image of the United States. And so even though the military and a lot of the brass of the military were from the South and they didn't want the civil rights movement, many of the Northern liberals and the Rockefellers and the Eastern establishment felt it was a way to clean up the image of American imperialism. And it was pressure from the communists, their effort to just raise that issue relentlessly and not let it drop from the 1920s all the way up into the 50s, 60s, and 70s. It was that even got us any notion of a civil rights movement in America. And it wasn't just the Soviet Union. There was also China, right? You can talk about Robert F. Williams was the leader of the NAACP in North Carolina, who had the NAACP start taking up guns to protect themselves. And when he had to flee the country, he fled to Cuba, he fled to China, he eventually set up Radio Free Dixie, broadcasting from Cuba revolutionary messages to black people in the United States. There's many examples of the support of the black freedom struggle by the communist governments of the world.
North Korea.
North Korea. You want to talk about,
I don't know the details, but I know a lot of the Black Panthers had a relation.
Yeah, Eldridge Cleaver lived in North Korea. His daughter was born in North Korea, and they considered the Black Panthers to be very close. And the North Korean ideology of Juche is a particularly nationalist ideology of self-reliance and independence. And Eldridge Cleaver actually published a compilation of Kim Il-sung's writings on the Juche ideology, saying that they matched kind of what the Black Panthers were striving for black people: self-determination, self-reliance, independence. And so that, North Korea had a huge support, and it was also during the Korean War, it was a lot of black GIs refusing to fight, and also there was a lot of propaganda from North Korea directed at American soldiers about Jim Crow segregation. The story that I've heard from Vietnam, this is from the Vietnam War, is that, you know, there was a black GI and two white GIs next to him, and they were going through the jungle, and, you know, the black GI was standing there, you know, and the white soldier next to him was shot, fell over, and the other white soldier next to him was shot and fell over, and then they heard a voice, you know, from the bush shout, "Black soldier, lay down your gun. You're an oppressed person too." You know, think about that. You know. So, you know, that was absolutely heavy. Now this is Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman wasn't a communist. She was an anarchist, and she was a radical, and she lived in New York City. And she was very much an advocate of birth control. She was very much an advocate of women's right to vote and feminism. And she was a very popular writer. She had a magazine called Mother Earth. Emma Goldman, she was known for, she was kind of the face of feminism and anarchism in America. She had a lot of quotes. She said, "If voting could change anything, it would be illegal already." That's one quote from her. It's famous. Emma Goldman, she was born in Russia, and she'd moved to the United States. She became this very well-known anarchist writer. A lot of people were reading her publications, etc. And after World War I and the Russian Revolution, the founder of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, decided he wanted to get her deported from the country. And that was very hard to do because there were a lot of wealthy people who really liked her writings. And so J. Edgar Hoover worked overtime to finally get her deported back to the Soviet Union. And she was deported back to the Soviet Union, and she was a dissident. She didn't really agree with the Soviet ideology, but she was considered a radical. She was a hero, and she lived in the Soviet Union. She was somewhat of a critic, a dissident. She didn't totally agree with what the Soviet Union was doing, and ultimately she died in the Soviet Union in 1939.
She died in Canada. She got, she was able to come. She didn't like the Bolsheviks eventually. She was an anarchist, so she tried to come back to the U.S., but it was impossible. She had her citizenship taken away from her, and that was like a big case, right? A big thing when they took away citizenship. And so her relatives like sent her remains back because they never let her in the U.S. again.
Wow.
Did she live at some time in Chicago? I don't know, but my
I
daughter
New York
has
City,
a friend that is like a great grandnephew, or his father is of Emma Goldman. But anyway, her family had to ship her remains back to be buried at the Haymarket Square Martyrs.
Yeah, and she's very much an icon. You know, a lot of anarchists really draw from her. You know, she wrote an essay that I think is pretty relevant in these times that was widely circulated, and it was called "Preparedness: The Road to Universal Slaughter." Because in the lead up to World War I, the leaders of the country were increasing the military budget, and they were saying, well, that's to prevent a giant war. And she said, actually, no, preparedness, you know, getting weapons and spending more and more money on weapons is ultimately going to lead to these weapons being used. And she was right. World War I did break out, you know, and I think it's particularly relevant in our time where, you know, it's like, you know, spending more and more money on the military. So we hope the day doesn't come that those missiles actually fly and that we all die, you know. Preparedness, the road to universal slaughter. That was Emma Goldman.
For justice thunders condemnations, a better world's in birth. No more traditions chains shall bind us. Arise, you slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been not, we shall be all. 'Tis the final conflict. Let all stand in his place. The international working class shall be the human race. 'Tis the final conflict. Let all stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race. We want no condescending saviors to rule us from the judgment hall. We workers ask not for their favors. Let us consult for all. To make the thief disgorge his booty, to free the spirit from itself. We must ourselves decide our duty. We must decide and do it well. 'Tis the final conflict. Let all stand in their place. The international working class
'tis the final conflict. Let all stand in their place. The international working class shall be the human race. Dare to struggle.
Dare to win.
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 And in that second verse that we sang, there's a line, to free the spirit from itself. That's what innovationism is about. The idea is that the beauty and the creativity of the human spirit is caged. It's held in a cell by the irrationality of the market. And that we can unleash it to build something absolutely beautiful. To free the spirit from the cell, we must all decide our duty. We must decide and do it well.
International